And we are back. Another topic very important these days is the situation regarding relationships. Very important from the first, Yahshua himself, he did explain what it means of having relationship in the flesh, and he precisely covered the situation regarding the divorce because the people came to him and said, is that legal for us to put our wives away? Because Moses gave us a certificate and he gave us the okay to do it. And Yahshua said absolutely not, because what he taught was they should be concerned of doing the original project, and obviously the father, Yahweh himself, would bring a wife to the husband and they would be one flesh. This is what Yahshua taught. And it's also important understanding is when Shaul went out and he was teaching to the Goys some guidelines of what this means. Okay, we understand that in a camp is complete. The camp is complete. The camp does not require faith. The camp does not require mercy. The situation is the camp is complete. So then when Shaul was going out and teaching the Goys, there were lots of situations going on. First, Shaul then, he had his own troubles, his own trialings, because every time he would expose sin from the people, they would turn against him. It's typical of demons. Every time he went into another country or another far place, they would come against him. And there was a part when the people, then the Goys, they begin to be more educated of the word of Elohim as the living Torah in themselves, as they were saved. They, by their own choice, they did receive the Messiah, Yahshua, and then their sins were done away with. They were washed away with his holy dam. They were obviously mikvahd, and then they would have the influence of Ruach HaKodesh outside, and they were linked with the spiritual line set in Shavuot. Many people don't understand this part, but later we're going to explain it. However, we also understand the part of the relationship of the Goys. When Shaul went out and he observed these people from pagan cultures, the most popular sin ever was the sexual sin. Perverted, dirty, and there were many kinds of sexual sins. There were temples, there were prostitutes, there were male prostitutes, and they were doing with each other, doing with the animals, doing with the children. It was absolutely disgusting. And then Shaul, being a shaliach, he was so trained. Imagine this, Shaul was a student of a great capability because he knew from Bereshit to Deuteronomy, from Genesis to Deuteronomy by mouth. He could quote any part of it. It was the minimum requirement to work under Gamaliel, the great Rabbi, very famous in the Holy Land. And then he was extremely talented, and he was obviously a person that had an anointing. But then, however, while he was teaching these to the Goys, he saw these people being involved in sexual troubles, and they are going through so much of then sacrifices in temple and prostitutes and kids involved in it. He had to come up with some sort of a guideline for these people outside. The situation was desperate. We don't understand sometimes the way Shaul lived back then, but when he faced these people in such a dire straits, in quote, he had to come up with some guidelines. So then it states, and concerning the situations that you wrote to me, is praiseworthy for a male not to come to a woman in regards to the faith and the teaching of the ministry. Okay, let's not try to make these complicated, but make it simple. First, the scriptures, they were given to the Goys for their salvation. They would be saved. The main objective was for the Goys to be saved. Then they would be forgiven of their sins, washed away by the holy dam of Yahshua the Mashiach. They would be then baptized or mikvad, and then they would have the relink established. And then afterwards they would, obviously in an instantaneous way, they would be relinked with the line that was placed in Shavuot. Later we should explain it. But then at this moment we understand that he had to come up with guidelines for them at least to have a decent family. And this is what he came up with. Then, but on behalf of the sexual temptation that was so rampant, it was disgusting back then. He was facing temples with the children in it, and they were paying large amounts of money to get a virgin in a temple so they could destroy themselves and defile themselves with their own demons over there. It was disgusting. So then Shaul began to teach, let each have his own wife and let a woman have her own husband. This is the basic teaching. And let the male then render to his wife the dues to the wife, and vice versa. So he had to come up with some guidelines. And then it goes on. The woman then is not sovereign over herself, and she is for her husband, and vice versa. But then don't deprive yourselves to one another, except when both consent for a time, devote yourselves to fasting and prayer. So what is the objective then? Some say there are lots of situations out there in contraceptive and they should not be used. It's absolutely true. They should not be used, because the relationship, the sexual relationship, was only meant for procreation. That's what the original plan was. It wasn't for them to go around and mounting each other so badly. But when then Shaul came to these pagan countries, he couldn't have any other thoughts other than put up some guidelines, because these people are mounting each other as animals. They must have some guidelines until they are educated in their minds, so that then the spirit of Elohim, through the influence of Ruach HaKodesh, then can begin to train them through faith in Yahshua the Mashiach, that someday they would be taken in a camp and form another group. So this was the objective. Truly then, he states then to come together often because they can't exercise discipline in their own bodies. And this is what he's saying. Was it for them to be mounting each other? No. The main objective is for the man to stay away from a woman, because he's talking about the main focus of the ministry. What did Yahshua say when he was talking about the cares of the world? He did not say that relationship was bad. He was saying the comparison with the ministry versus having a family, those are not the same. When a person has a relationship and has a family, there are obviously obligations as a result of it. And the ministry most of the time gets pushed aside, because the cares of the world, the cares of the children, then the cares of the house, the cares of the lawn, the cares of these, that, and the other gets on the way of the ministry most of the time. And mostly because there is a false savior out there, and his name is not Yahshua the Mashiach. And then they have this false fable going on top of it, and then a situation becomes nearly to the point of being undoable. Except when Ruach HaKodesh begins to clean up and then begins to teach properly. Yahshua is the Mashiach, and salvation only through him. So returning to what Shaul was teaching them, is that proper then for a man to touch a woman? No. The main goal of Shaul was to recruit the males for further teaching. This was the objective. Kingdom to come first. He did not say that it was wrong having relationship. But the main objective was to form another group, and then form another group, form another group, form another group, and form another group. And those that were drawn away from the goys for the special teaching, those had to put the flesh under subjection. And in the camp, They understand very plainly. Sex is only for procreation. There is no other purpose for it. And then there is, for instance, the Song of Solomon. Explains bringing pleasure to the mate. Those were mostly taught because they were for the people and the males that were older. So they would exercise what Solomon taught, but only the time they would come together for having kids. No other time. There was no time for them to be wasting with mounting each other around. The ministry must come first. And that's why there is a place where a person can exercise this area that Solomon taught, the Song of Solomon, for a specific purpose. The rest is the ministry. And that's why they are set apart people, because the Creator has set guidelines for them to live by. Would they do this outside of the camp? Obviously not. What was the goal of Shaul? He wanted to recruit males for another group. This is what he was doing. Don't you want to be perfect? He said being perfect, being complete, meant you'd be selected to go into the camp and be trained, and then would form another group. But when he encountered some of these cultures, they were so disgusting, he had to come up with some guidelines. So let then the male have his wife and vice versa, and let them render each other what they are to be rendering each other. Obviously, he saw that a lot of these people, they would more than likely never be drawn in the camp, because they can't exercise control of their own flesh. And then he goes on. Therefore, do not deprive yourselves except when both consent at a time to devote yourselves to fasting and prayer, and return again to the same disposition. If you decide to get in a relationship, then it's another situation. But ministry comes first. There are some people that Yahweh the Father, He wants in His ministry. Some people He does not want. Some people are set to have a family and set of their own. But they should not interfere with the ministry. Ministry comes first. And this is what Shaul is explaining. So is that wrong for a person to use contraceptive? Of course it's wrong. Of any kind, because it was not the original state. The original state from the Creator is having sex only when procreating. This is what it was. And then Shaul gave guidelines later, because they were so disgusting outside of the camp. He had to come up with some guidelines. But this is the guideline that Shaul gave from a perspective of the camp. And the camp is where Elohim lives. And this is what's for. Sex only for procreation. But then some people say, come on. And then the time of David was conquering the land, and does it not say coming home and bringing joy to the wife? Yes, this is what he said. Procreate, because the land must be reinforced with more people. This is the meaning of it. It's not for them to go around having sex as a pleasure of life. It's not part of it. It's not part of the first plan. Because the more pleasure the flesh is given, the more pleasure the flesh wants. It is truly a destructive cycle. And then there is this pleasure, and then there is this other pleasure, and then brings the other pleasure. And when a person realizes, where is the scripture? What have you learned lately? And then they observe back, boy, the scriptures are far away behind. Cares of the world. This is what Yahshua taught. So then, what is Shaul is saying? There is a balance that goes on in everyday living. But then his desire is, and concerning the situations that you wrote to me, it is praiseworthy for a male not to come to a woman. It is praiseworthy. Praiseworthy means his objective was to recruit males for another group. Does it mean that the man would never have a wife in the future? Absolutely not. The main point of Shaul was recruiting the males, and then Shaul would direct them to Ruach HaKodesh. From that point, Shaul was out of the situation. His part then was done. Recruiting more goys to form another group. Sometimes Ruach HaKodesh wants to have this particular male with a wife from the camp, and then they go out together as a family. Shaul said, let whatsoever be done orderly. And Ruach HaKodesh in the camp has dominion, because Elohim is living in the camp. So then, people should be concerned in using contraceptives. Of course they should be concerned. Do they want to remain goys forever, or do they want to be part of the ministry? They have to ask themselves. If they want to be part of the ministry, can they stay away from the pleasures of the flesh so they can spend time in the Word? Or they go from pleasure to pleasure to pleasure to pleasure, and then when they, under such circumstances, they open up the Word, and what do you understand? Well, they don't have a clue. Because they were so indulged in trying to satisfy the flesh, and then when the time of understanding and sharing the Word, they don't have a clue. What is the Savior? What is your gifting? It doesn't exist anyway, but ask, what is your gift in the church? So then Shaul is giving some guidelines, because what he encountered was absolutely disgusting. Disgusting beyond measure. And he came in with these guidelines as in the 1 Corinthians the 7th chapter, and states what should be done and should not. So then, is proper for the male not to touch a woman? This is the objective from the Creator. Because the main topic is having males set apart in a camp, then to guide another group to form another Holy Land. And then, sometimes, then Ruach HaKodesh decides that in the camp, these males should have a wife. And then in the camp, from a lady from the camp, is joined with the male. Either they stay in an existing camp, or they go out in another camp. So there is no such, for instance, having this religious understanding of family, because family is religious. Family has nothing to do with it. In fact, being truly honest, the family is only a hindrance when it comes to the ministry, because it involves the cares of the world. It does not mean that the family is bad, only explaining there is a focus first in the ministry, then the family. Yahshua said, if you do not hate your husband or wife, your daughter, then you are not worthy of me. What he's saying, if you prefer having your family, have your family and stay outside of the camp. But don't interfere with the ministry. The ministry comes first. And this is what Shaul is simply relaying. So it's very important and very exciting teaching these truths, because then people can understand what is the original plan versus what was given to them as a patch-up. Okay? What Shaul gave was a mere understanding and guidelines. Guidelines, so they would have at least a decent lifestyle while they learn to put their flesh under the control. And they would subject their souls to the Spirit. And then as they would learn from the people of the camp, then they would have at least a lifestyle that would be pleasing to Elohim. And this is what Shaul taught. But much more coming up. Please stay tuned.